Well, welcome back, everybody. Welcome back. Happy 4th of July. So, today I want to talk about MAGA and my ongoing discussion of how MAGA is not a cult. I don't think it's a cult based on a previous episode I did where I dissected it using Robert J. Lifton's 8 criteria points that a cult must have. And we got like just a couple of sub points. And as I said, pretty much any group would have those sub points. They're human nature. And also, uh, they would maybe apply to like a small group of people, but one church in Georgia does not make 50 million people a cult. So I think I thoroughly debunked the idea that MAGA is a cult. And I will stand up against anyone and put that point of view out there. Interestingly enough, right after I did that episode, a friend of mine, ultra liberal, senior citizen, goes out with signs on the weekends. You could fill in the gaps. Sent me to a website to prove me wrong. And this website had a test, and you take the test, it gives you a result. And so I took the test, and it said that this group that I was answering the questions for was 5% of a cult, which is basically what I said. And then I looked at what it used behind the test to figure it out, the methodology, and it listed Robert J. Lifton. So I wrote back to my friend. I'm like, you literally sent me to a website citing the thing that I cited, and it proved me right. She didn't respond. I don't know why. But she lives with her mother and her sister, and her brain would literally explode if she started to think outside of the box that the three of them live in. She has my sympathies. But I have debunked MAGA as a cult, and today we're going to look at another point of view on this. Because if you watch the show, you know I do try to be fair, sometimes at least, and I do try to look at the bigger picture. Like when I look at my gurus, I look at a bunch of videos by them to get a clear picture. So I thought we would look at some other points of view about whether or not MAGA is a cult. I might be wrong on some points. Maybe there's some things that I forgot about when discussing Robert J. Lifton. So today I have an article that we're going to read from Salon.com, written in May 2025, and the title of it Is Donald Trump's movement really a cult? Well, I ought to know. And the subtitle is I grew up in what many people would consider a cult. Compared to that, Americans still have freedom. And this is written by Jonathan Hirsch, Hirsch. In the description below, you can find a link to this article. And as I said, this is from May 18th, 2025. So I'm going to be reading it, commenting upon it, seeing where I disagree with it or where I agree with it, whatever. In all honesty, I haven't actually read the entire article. I deliberately held back. So we're going to do that. Before I get any farther, it is a warm day. I have a fan here. I have a fan just out of view. It was 101 here in Maine yesterday, which broke records of like it was hotter than in places in Texas. uh, so hopefully I won't sweat under this light too much. I'm using the using the headset, though I actually find I don't prefer it anymore, so you don't hear the fan. Hopefully the volume is okay. Actually, why don't we check that? Hang on one second. Well, I ought to know. Seems to be okay for me. Hope it's okay for you. The chat window is open if you're viewing this live on YouTube, and feel free to put things in the chat, but I'm going back and forth between a couple windows here, so I may not see your response. Don't take it personally. I'm just I got a small screen. Anyways, let's dive into this interesting article. And starting off, it says, in July of 2016, then candidate Donald Trump announced that the fate of the country was in peril. In a televised speech, Trump announced that only one person was equipped to turn the sinking ship of America around. This wasn't the first fire and brimstone political speech in our history, and certainly wouldn't be the last. And this man, once seen as a performative figure, a political sideshow, has metamorphosized into a towering and singular figure in America whose significance goes far beyond politics. Some would argue his influence has taken on an almost religious character. That speech at the Republican convention in Cleveland marked the moment when I, the author of this, started to internalize how much the political and ideological winds were shifting in the nation. At the time, Trump's words shook me, and not only for the obvious reasons. It wasn't how his now ubiquitous polemical flourish or even what that implied about his approach to governing. It was actually his exact phrase that I couldn't let go of. Quote from Trump, "I alone can fix this." Continuing to read, to say that I alone can do virtually anything suggests a degree of permanency, perhaps even supernatural power, in a world that is entirely interdependent down to the molecules that make up our bodies. To suggest that any one person can singularly do anything without the support of others is quite a stretch. And hearing the phrase, quote, "I alone," invoked for me a memory of another time. I'd heard the phrase before, as a kid growing up in Northern California. Sometimes living on a commune and surrounded by hundreds of people who had all come together to do the same thing: worship a man named Franklin Jones. If you wanted happiness or salvation, you needed to follow him. Continuing to read, the overall message of one of Jones's most prominent books could be summarized as, quote, "I alone am the way," end quote, meaning he is the true path to enlightenment. He was a controversial guru and spiritual teacher who also went by the names Rakshira Avatar, Adi Da Samraj, the Divine World Teacher, and the True Heart Master Sri Sri Bhagavan Adidam, among countless others. He called his group Adidam. By the time I was a teenager, he had declared himself to be a unique incarnation of God, a physical manifestation of divinity here on earth, sent to liberate us from what he called the dark times, or Kali Yuga. His seminal essay was entitled, quote, "I Alone and the Adidam Revelation." So you're going to pause here in my reading. So when I saw this article, I jumped because I was a follower of the cult Adidam, following Rikshiravatar Adi Da Samraj. I was not living in a commune, far from it. I had my own apartment and just went to meetings or talked to folks on the phone or email. But I did take a vow in front of 30 people, pay hundreds, if not close to $1,000 in a year, and do all sorts of stuff, and had a study group in my house, and go to a weekend long retreat before I said, "F you, I'm out of here. This is a cult. Everything I've put in the back of my head is true. Adida is dead, but the peer pressure is here." So when I saw someone writing who also belonged to this organization, I was like, wow, I need to share this article because this is an interesting approach, because we both come from the same religious thing. We see Donald Trump, and I don't know about this person, maybe they'll say, but when Donald Trump came out in 2015, I didn't support him. I've said that many times. I supported Ted Cruz. Actually, I will brag. I have right here, I'm reading his One Vote Away book. I thought he would be a better president. I still think that. I don't think he would have won, but I think he would have been a better president if he had won. But I didn't support Trump. I didn't support Trump until the media lambasted him over and over and over again for things that he didn't seem to be doing. And then I was like, wow, the media is really off the rocker. And then I slowly started supporting him. We'll see what this person says if they say anything about that. So I have not read anything else in this article. Once I saw that this person was a follower of Adidam, I stopped there and brought it to all of you to share, to see how two people from the same background relate. I do not know, what's his name, Jonathan Hirsch. I've never heard that name. Maybe we overlapped, maybe we didn't. Um, if he was a teenager living in California, not necessarily. I did have email communication with Adi Da folks, and I was on Facebook with Adi Da folks across the country for a brief amount of time, but I don't really remember names. And what names I do know tend to be folks who are very proactive. They have websites, they have things out there, and this one doesn't come to mind. But we may have crossed paths. Who knows? I don't know. But we lived in two very different worlds of Adidam. I'm openly saying he was a cult leader, but now let's turn to Jonathan and continue this and see what he says, and then see what he says about Trump. So I hope you enjoy this read. I've been looking forward to doing this with all of you to see what this guy writes about our shared background and the perspective on MAGA. So here we go. Quote, it'll come as no surprise that Franklin Jones has often been described as a cult leader, although that was certainly not how I viewed him growing up. I want to pause here for a minute. He refers to him as Franklin Jones, not as Adi Da, which was the name he had when he passed away, and the name he had for quite a few years before he died. And this says a lot that he's referring to this guy in his real name, not his spiritual name. It's sort of like, I'm not going to refer to you in that view because I don't see that view anymore. Same thing has been happening in the International Sanatana Dharma Society with Sri Dharma Pravataka Acharya, which I've talked about in numerous videos, a group that I left. And I've been seeing ex folks who have also left, ex devotees, followers, whatever you want to call them, who have left. They tend to refer to Sri Dharma as Frank, his birth name. And I've spoken to a few people about this, and they're like, I cannot recognize his spirituality, therefore I'm not going to recognize his name. So this is very interesting that he calls him Franklin Jones. It could be seen as a sign of disrespect, but it's also a sign of I'm no longer recognizing you for who you say you are. Okay, let's keep going. He may not have this view, but it is interesting that he calls him Franklin Jones. All right, here we go. Quote, he was the wise and compassionate guru, as well as the person who captured virtually every moment of my parents' interest and attention. I was along for the ride. As a teenager, my parents became Franklin's personal acupuncturist, which brought them very close to his inner circle of followers, at least until a falling out severed them from the group completely. I lived quietly with the inner turmoil and trauma of my adolescent years in his group until 2017, when I released the documentary podcast series Dear Franklin Jones, which detailed my life in the group and featured interviews with other former members, including my parents. End of reading. I've never heard of that. This is the first time I've seen it. Maybe I'll have to investigate that. Maybe you might have to investigate that. So, Dear Franklin Jones is the podcast. Continuing to read, the success of that series forced me to confront difficult aspects of my childhood, including the fraught relationship I had tenuously built with my dad. By the time word got around about the series, my father and I were very much estranged, but after he was diagnosed with dementia and became unable to care for himself, I was forced to confront our toxic relationship while also becoming responsible for his care. It's the subject of my new audio memoir, The Mind is Burning, Losing My Father to a Cult and Dementia. In my creative work, and especially in writing my memoir, I have become attuned to making connections between my past and present. So, when I first heard Trump's speech in 2016, those words, quote, I alone, took me to a very specific, very raw place. It reminded me of the years I spent as a child under the specter of an authoritarian spiritual figure. As a child, I was led to believe that one man, and in our case, an ordinary looking guy from Jamaica, Queens, exactly the same neighborhood where Donald Trump was born and raised, was in fact God incarnate. The startling parallel between these two men, and that phrase in particular, remains intensely resonant for me. They both seem to be reaching towards a kind of ubiquity, an authority that transcends their own personhood, a godlike person. My journey to finding peace with everything that I saw and struggled with in Franklin's group was neither straightforward nor easy. In the years since then, I have continued to write and report on various fringe religious groups, including several that have been labeled as cults. What I continue to struggle with, however, is the word itself. Is it an extension of fandom, with public figures amassing cults of their own? Are the worldwide legions of Swifties, Taylor Swift's most devoted fans, actually members of a cult? What exactly is a cult? And under the new Trump administration, are we living in one now? End quote. Though I actually did a video responding to people who were saying Taylor Swift was a cult leader and Swifties were a cult. And that was so quickly debunked as garbage. And if they're a cult, then anybody who likes any superstar is a cult or musician or whatever. Completely thrown out the door. I did find myself watching a video of a Christian who was massing this long list of, well, she's the devil and she does this and she promotes this. Again, though, promoting bad things like sex outside of marriage doesn't make you a cult leader and doesn't make followers cult members. But I did a video on that. I just was so curious about that. I don't think there is actually any. No, let me rephrase that. Of all the musicians out there today, I don't think they're cult members. I can think of one musician who has a cult. That's Charles Manson. I can think of another one, David Koresh, who was a failed musician. That's another one. They're very few. Most people aren't. Continuing to read, though. Quote, somewhere along the line, cult has come to mean so many things that I am no longer sure it means anything at all. And no modern public figure is more often described as a cult leader than our duly elected president. A few months into his chaotic second term, the question of whether or not the movement that he has started is effectively a cult has become a live one once again. To appreciate how we got here, we need to understand the word itself and how it caught fire in popular culture. Just to pause, I'm not really saying much in response to this article yet because I feel there's nothing really to respond upon. He isn't really talking about Donald Trump, but we're about to. So I've just been letting the story unroll. It speaks for itself. So, quote, the meaning of the word cult has changed quite a bit. It was originally used simply to describe small fringe religious movements, groups that were offbeat and outside the mainstream, but not necessarily sinister. In fact, many groups that were once considered cults, such as the Mormons and Seventh day Adventists, are now regarded as widestream religions. End quote. Yeah, I'm pretty sure 99% of people still consider the Mormons cults, and they do actually fall in line with Robert J. Lifton's of 8 points of what is a cult. They actually do fall in line with that. So they are a cult. They may be a mainstream religion, but that doesn't mean they're not a cult. Call Islam a cult. That's a mainstream religion. Seventh day Adventists, I think at one point were a cult. I don't know if they still are as much. And I don't really know how mainstream they really are. There's also a trend in academia now to not use the word cult, but to say new religious movement, because we don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. So I have to disagree with his point. I think that the Mormons are still considered a cult, and I think most people still see them as a cult. I have never met a person in my life who considers Mormons to be a mainstream religion. They are still seen as a fringe, except maybe in academic college groups that don't want to hurt people's feelings. And as for Seventh Day Adventists, I really don't know. They're pretty much an offshoot. I'll stand by that too, just in the sense of walk up to anyone on the street, ask them if Mormons are a mainstream religion and not a cult, and I will bet money. It's not a scientific survey, but I'm willing to bet money like a horse race that most people will go, yeah, eh. To continue reading, to continue reading. Then came Charles Manson. The Tate LaBianca murders of 1969 struck fear into mainstream America, and this frightening hippie who supposedly compelled his acolytes to commit murder became the boogeyman of the counterculture era. Suddenly, a cult meant something worse and more dangerous than a small group of ideologues or a charismatic leader. It could be a threat to public safety. Meanwhile, alternative religions were flourishing. Their was the rebirth of evangelical Christianity, known as the Jesus movement, or also the Jesus People movement, the Hindu sect that became the Hare Krishnas, and dozens more gurus and spiritual guides, churches and communes. Many were harmless, but others wielded deep and troubling control over their members. Then, of course, came Jamestown. And I'm going to pause here. Um, he is right. I disagree with him on Mormons, but he is really right when it comes to cult studies. Robert J. Lifton published his book on cult studies, what, 1961, somewhere around there, after studying cults in China in the 50s. But it really was Charles Manson and then Jonestown that made it up front. And that's when really things started to happen and cults began to be discussed and studied on a far deeper and wider level, not just in religious communities, but in academia and all over. And also when the definition became sort of wibbly wobbly, I think. When a cult can be whatever you kind of want it to be, kind of like gender is now, and the discussion over cults became blurry. Though there's many of us who still push Robert J. Lifton, you see his name all the time. Adi Da, to quote him, used to say that everything changed with Jonestown. He already had the Adidam group, though it was called Dawn Horse Communion or something else at that point. And he said that once that happened, for him and anyone else who had a religious group, the world radically changed for them. Actually, at that point, we also had the, blanking on the word right now, sort of the rehabilitation movement. That's not the right word, but where folks would literally be ripped from their religious group or cult group, put into a room and deprogrammed. Sorry, the deprogramming movement, and then turned out. The joke always is, yes, my daughter was ripped from the Hare Krishnas and was deprogrammed, and now she's a nice believing Christian, except she's Jewish. The Hare Krishnas were actually brought to court in the late 70s after Swami Prabhupada's death, not for controversy around his leaders, but for uh, all sorts of things. Some of them was deprogramming related, some were other things. The fear of cults really grew after Jonestown. It grew with Charles Manson and then it really blossomed. And so we see in the late 70s and 80s all this deprogramming stuff. We see lawsuits. We see all sorts of stuff that a lot of people don't really want to talk about. I have literally had Hindus say to me, don't talk about any of this, we'll just have to move on. And I say, no, that's called lack of self awareness and forgetting the past and not being honest. You want to see no evil, hear no evil. No, we should talk about these things. I believe that if the Hare Krishna movement did, ISKCON did, they were more open about the past. They were more open about their ministers who have abused and raped and done whatever. They would be growing, not sort of dying in America. And they are dying in North America. That's what happens when you close yourself to the past. But it's really interesting how really the world of cults is a relatively new thing within the past 50, 60 years. So he gives a description about Jim Jones. I'm going to skip it because we all know that, but he ends with the sentence, suddenly cult became synonymous with totalitarian mind control. The idea that someone could be brainwashed to the point of self-destruction shook the public to its core. A wave of anti-cult activism followed. Families claimed their loved ones had been brainwashed, and groups like the Cult Awareness Network emerged to fight back. Suddenly, any religious movement that deviated from the mainstream risked being labeled a cult. I'm going to pause here. He actually talks about deprogrammers and how that came up, and then he says, "Oh, okay, we'll get to the next paragraph." I see. I haven't read this, and now I'm sort of preempting him a little bit. But I do want to praise this article, even though it's probably like, what's the point? I'm supposed to be talking about Adidam and MAGA, and I'm going on and on. But honestly, I am so glad that he's talking about cults and the definition of cults. One thing I see all the time, you will find comments of mine on YouTube under Kyle, what's his name, colored hair, liberal commentator, saying, nice how you did a video that didn't bother to define cult and you just suddenly label people as cults, but you didn't define it. And yet we all have different definitions. I've put that comment up so many times. A lot for him, you know who I'm talking about, but others too. We just throw the word out there. Well, that's a cult. Aren't you pleased with my intellect that I was able to point out a cult? But quite honestly, if you walk down the street, just as everyone's going to have an opinion on Mormonism, that they're good or bad, or probably bad, you're also going to find every single person's going to have a different definition of what is a cult. They may all say Mormons are a cult, but they'll have a definition of how we get there. I've seen people say one or two things make you a cult. If you ask for money and you have a big ego, that makes you a cult leader. Okay, do you really think Bill Gates is a cult leader? You think, really? Didn't Joe Biden ask for money during his campaign? I guess he's a cult leader. It's not that easy, but this is the problem we have, and people just throw out these sound bites and then literally expect everyone to applaud them. Oh my God, you pointed at a cult. What nobody's doing is defining a cult. So I really, really give this guy kudos for defining a cult and taking this long introduction to get to the point and to declare what a cult is, so we're all on the same page. And we are getting to the politics. So I'm just seeing if I want to. Yeah, we'll read this because this is an interesting thing to be aware of. It's not something I've talked about a lot on my show. I have thought about it, we just haven't gotten there yet. But this is an interesting paragraph. Quote, a vigorous debate on terminology ensued, rife with controversy. Some scholars began to use the term new religious movement to differentiate small religious groups from the stigmatized word cult. By the 1980s, the term destructive cults began to appear. It seemed to offer a clearer definition of the kinds of cults that scare us, while also insinuating an anti-cult advocates also insulating anti cult advocates from the threat of litigation, which became a tool of suppressing dissent for certain well-funded religious groups. The cult wars broke out, an intense series of disputes over what a cult actually was and what rights or recourse dissenters had against these groups, playing out both in the courts and public discourses. End quote. I hinted on this already. The courtroom vows. One thing that came out of this courtroom thing was it was declared that ISKCON is actually a Hindu religion, and due to that, it is recognized as a religion by the United States government and receives all the rights of a religion. Thus, whenever I see a Hindu say, well, Hinduism is not a religion, it's a way of life. Okay, according to your sentence, your temple is no longer a 501c3 nonprofit entity, and you no longer have any of the rights of a religion because the Constitution does not say groups that identify themselves as a way of life have the rights of a religion. No. And I literally see in books published by ISKCON people, well, we're not a religion and we're not Hinduism. Okay, then you have none of the rights of a religion, so please contact the IRS for tax fraud. You owe a lot of money. I notice no one's doing that though, because suddenly they go, oh, well, we are a religion or whatever. So this is such a bullshit thing. Either you are or you aren't. And all these Hindus who say it's a way of life, well, according to the United States, it's not. It's a religion. And I would agree with that unless you want to turn around and talk to the IRS and have your temple closed because of all the money you're going to owe for tax fraud, posing as a religion. So start calling yourself a religion. And also stop calling yourself a way of life, because I have never found anyone involved in religion, and I've been all around the world, who have said, oh, no, no, my religion is a religion and not at all a way of life. Nobody says that. Much like there's not a single religious person in the world who goes, my spiritual book, well, it isn't actually the words of God. The others have the words, but this isn't the true, and this isn't a true book. Nobody says that other than the Church of Bob or the Elvis Presley Presbyterian Church. They all say they're a way of life. They all say they have God on their side. They have the Word of God and all this stuff. But just stop now. It's all garbage. It's all garbage. And if you want to uphold that view, fine. But let's talk to the IRS. That's what came out of the rulings for ISKCON. Also, that the deprogramming thing was not a good thing after all. Okay, but let's keep going here. He says, but while these stories of cults are frightening, the way that the concept of cults has migrated into pop culture has, in my view, effectively disarmed the term. We've made cult into a kind of aesthetic. It is no longer only or even primarily about control and coercion. Now we use cult as a kind of metaphor to describe anything with an intense following. I would agree with him on that. Just search the word on Etsy and you'll find dozens of pithy phrases on cute stickers and t-shirts that minimalize or contradict the word's original import. And of course, there's also a mountain of product equating Trump and the MAGA movement with cultism. Quote, if you're not outraged, you're in a cult. Seeing these ideas permeate the culture over the years has left me confused and frustrated. As someone raised in a group that went from a polite, hippie-ish spiritual community to an isolated entity with its own cosmology, I think we've lost the thread. We joke about cult favorite beauty products and cult status movies. It's a shorthand for devotion, loyalty, and obsession. And when people talk about MAGA as a cult, it seems to exist in that hazy liminal space between a negative attribution of a fan group and something more sinister. As American politics have become increasingly divisive and supercharged by information, the term seeks to apply our understanding of dangerous and fanatical religious groups to extreme political beliefs. Is that a fair application? Is MAGA really a cult? The definition that makes the most sense to me is the one that tells us what a cult does rather than what it is. Robert J. Lifton, one of the first scholars to explore on what cults are and are not, says that a cult exhibits three main characteristics. I'm going to pause here. So, one of the reasons I really like Robert J. Lifton is if you look at his cult criteria, it can apply to anything, not just religions. It can apply to Star Trek fans, it can apply to Doctor Who fans, it can apply to book novelists, it can apply to political groups. It is not religious. There is barely anything, and we went through the list on that episode where I was talking about Donald Trump, or talking about MAGA and how it's not a cult. There's not anything there that is really religious, and that's what makes that, for me, one of the best litmus tests. I've also used his litmus test and applied it to things, not just on the show, but in my own life, and I've not ever found it not to work. There are other models out there. The bite model was created later on using his stuff, but I feel that they simplified it and they added a ton of religious stuff to it. So now you have to go, well, we have to weed this out, we have to weed this out, we have to weed this out to make it work. And once you weed all that stuff out, you're back to Robert J. Lifton. So it's like you didn't need to reinvent the model, but you did it because that's what we do all the time. I feel he's really the best. There may be other models out there other than the Bite, B-I-T-E, and Lifton. I'm not familiar with them, but for me, he's just proven himself. Nearly, no, well, not nearly a century later, but we're working on it and getting there. And this has just held up, even though this model, and okay, another reason I love his model, it was written, as I said, in the 1950s from his work in China. He studied cult groups in China in the 1950s. When Jim Jones appeared, his model still worked. When Charles Manson appeared, his model still worked. In 2026, when MAGA appears, and how different is the world from 1956 to 1926? Sorry, 1926, 2026. How different is this world, yet his model still works. I do not believe it is necessary to create a new model to reflect a new society when the old model is still coming true. That's why I like his model. And I do not believe there is a necessity to create a model that involves religion when the non religious model works. So that's why I love Robert J. Lifton. Now, I did not know that he mentioned Robert J. Lifton in this article. As I said at the beginning of the show, I actually haven't read this article. I only got to the point where he said he was involved in Adidam, realized I had someone in the same group, and stopped there. So before I get into it more, he does say that Robert J. Lifton says that a cult exhibits three main characteristics. There's actually 8 points that I have talked about, and that's not really a conflict. There's lots to Robert J. Lifton. He had a book about this, more than one book. It's on my shelf. And he does say there is characteristics, but then he also has a list of criteria points. And he goes, when you have these 8 points, you do have a cult. But you can have a summary, something, whatever. So it's not a complete conflict of things I said. So he does talk about the 3 points here, and I'm going to go into them because we start to talk about MAGA at this point, which is why you're listening to this show. So here we go. Quote, the first point, a charismatic leader, Robert J. Lifton wrote. So, a compelling thinker and speaker who can make people believe anything. Trump absolutely fits this bill. In fact, it appears to me to be one of his superpowers, the ability to read how a large population is feeling and to compel them to act in his own interest, which brings us to Lifton's second defining process. So, I'm going to pause here and say, no, I actually disagree with this. Yes, it does appear that Trump can make people do things like during COVID drink poisonous items, but is he making 50 million people drink poisonous items? No. Many are like, no, he's still wrong. So many people are not believing him. It's not that he can make everyone believe that, but some people will. But also, Adam Schiff got on the news and said that Trump had a scandal going on with Russia, and everyone believes that. So does that make Adam Schiff a cult leader? Technically, yes. Nancy Pelosi and AOC have both gotten out and said over and over and over again about horrible things about Trump. Does this make them cult leaders? Well, technically, yes, because people seem to swallow what they say without questioning it. So let's be honest, if Trump fits the bill, so does a lot of other people. A lot of politicians. I've never seen anyone on the left question anything Adam Schiff says. He says Trump is treasonous. Well, they go with it. They go with it. So yes, Trump fits the bill, but so does his peers. Would we call Nancy Pelosi a cult leader? Maybe, maybe not. As for reading the population, I don't know if Trump really is good about reading how the population feels. I've always wondered about that. I've always wondered if he really did read the population or if he just sort of reads what the population says and then sort of regurgitates it. Because it feels like a lot of times he comments on X on things that I don't think a lot of conservatives necessarily agree with. And he's just spouting stuff. Other times it feels like he's just repeating what he's seen. I don't necessarily think he has his finger on the pulse. And I don't think he then forces people to compel them to act in his interest. I really disagree with this point. I think AOC might have her finger more on the pulse in some ways. She seems to be bringing up issues which are more relevant to people. Her solutions I disagree with, but that's different. I really don't know if Trump is really involved. I think he's pretty much focused on himself. I think he's incredibly narcissistic and he's focused on himself. And he happens to know that conservatives follow this path, liberals follow this, and he tends to bounce things out which are conservative, but there's a lot of times people just sort of go, yeah, whatever. So I have to disagree with that. But let's continue a little bit because today's episode was a back and forth on points. I said I was going to do this. So the next point, quoting from Lifton, says a process. To be a cult, a group must have a philosophy unto itself and a process for re educating its followers in the philosophy of its group. For me, growing up, that included communal acts of worship, rituals, and an impossibly long reading list of doctrinal considerations from the leader. It's a bit of a stretch, but MAGA, in a way, does appear to deploy a re-education process. If you're unhappy with the way your life is going and believe America is on the wrong track, the promise is offered that Trump is here to give your life meaning and make America great again. End quote. That is beyond a stretch. It's actually a completely different thing. So first of all, I do not believe MAGA really has a theology. There is a conservative and liberal theology. MAGA seems to be whatever Donald Trump thinks. He doesn't really seem to follow a set belief system. Also, there are no books on the right that people are reading. There's no reading list. The left, actually, funny enough, kind of has one. There are no communal acts of worships or rituals. There's no re-education classes. Adidam had classes, matter of fact. I don't really see MAGA as having a re-education process at all. I don't even think it's a stretch. I think he's just totally wrong. I just don't think there's a re-education process. If you are disagreeing with Trump, also, who's going to tell you to be re-educated? Nobody. Is Trump going to call you up? Well, I heard you disagree with me. That's a huge problem. I need to take a class. Or you need to read my book, Art of the Deal. No one's doing that. No one will call you out and re-educate you. In Adidam, they would do that. Hey, you should consider this class by the Don Horse Institute or the Laughing Man Institute. You should do that. Or you should read this book. That doesn't happen in MAGA. I don't really see this. So I don't really see any re-education process in MAGA. You're free to read whatever you want, and if you disagree, no one forces you to then keep reading those MAGA books, which don't exist. You have to read that William F. Buckley book. You've sinned against Trump. Doesn't happen. As for if you are unhappy, quote, if the way your life is going, you believe America's on the wrong track, the promise is offered that Trump is going to give your life meaning and make America great again. That's a campaign promise. That is completely different than what a cult leader does within re-education program. I want you to show me one politician from any point in the history of America for any position who said, please elect me for this position. I am not going to do anything of value. I'm not going to help you. And I'm going to make your life suck. Please show me one politician that is their campaign. Actually, no, not excluding Frank Zappa. He even promised happiness. George Burns and Gracie Allen promised happiness. Pat Paulson promised happiness. That is what politicians do. They make personal promises that it will be better for you if you vote for them, so you should vote for them versus the other guy who is making other promises that will ruin your life. This is not like a cult leader. This is actually what 100% of politicians do. Seriously, find me a politician who says they're going to make your life worse. Even Graham Plattner doesn't say that. Bernie Sanders is saying if you vote for him, he'll bring socialism and your life will be amazing. Nowadays, he says if you vote for him, he's going to fight for democracy because he's suddenly against socialism, because anything to get rid of Trump. But this isn't really. This guy is stretching this so far. He is comparing political campaigning with a cult leader. And again, if we take this guy literally, I think he needs to go back and read Robert J. Lifton, actually, which would be a re-education thing. But he's really stretching it. If we take this literally, according to this author, every single politician since the dawn of America is a cult leader and potentially leading a cult. Because they've all made this same promise. They all make people believe anything. So 100% of politicians then. So if 100% of politicians are now cult leaders, this guy has literally argued that cult is now a meaningless word, fighting against his own article. So we have to be careful here when we make these stretches. If you're just going to make a stretch just to rag on MAGA, we should be fair. Now, again, as I said, I don't think MAGA is a cult because there's no re-education process. I think promising that I'll make your life better and then whether I do it or not as a politician is very different than a guru who says I will make your life better, and then whatever happens, he will continue to tell you, I made your life better. Did you see that forest fire? I stopped it. What would you do without me? Trump says, well, the vote didn't pass. Wasn't anything I could do about it. He doesn't say, well, the vote passed even if it didn't. There may be things he disagrees with, and he's verbal about that, but he doesn't come out. I've never seen Trump come out, well, I've brought peace to the world, and everyone now has happiness because it didn't happen. He's not crazy. A cult leader will actually tell you things that defy reality. But let's keep going. One more point here that this guy quotes from Lifton. He says, abuse. Once followers of a cult are under the sway of their leader and have been re-educated in the beliefs of the group, Lifton stipulates that they can be compelled to act against their own personal interests. This can mean anything from giving away their personal wealth and belongings to the leader all the way up to the acts of terrorism or mass suicide. And, well, interesting, he doesn't talk about Trump here because you can't. I don't see people giving away their money to Trump. Now, I had a YouTuber once I saw who said that there are people who follow Trump around wherever he goes and they live in vans and they've given away everything and they give him their money every month. But I don't believe that. Please show me one of those people. And to be MAGA, you don't have to give away your salary. To join other religious groups, you do walk in and hand over your money. Everything. You hand over everything. You have nothing. That doesn't happen here. And as for working against their own personal interests, you can say that Republicans are voting for Trump who works against them. And I will refer you to the book, What's the Matter with Kansas, which was written before Trump. It's a boring read, though, but it explains why people voted Democrat when they made sense for them to vote Republican, because the Democrats worked against their own interests. So anyone who calls up, well, Republicans are doing this, yet Democrats did the same thing, there's a book about it. You probably didn't read it, though, and that book has been forgotten from public discourse. This is something that happens all the time. People often vote against their personal interests. Actually, at our jobs, we often do things against our personal interests because we're supposed to, or it's for the betterment of the organization or something. We do this all the time. This doesn't necessarily point to one as being a member of a cult. Okay, let's keep going. He goes in this article, when we reach the third point, I believe the purest definition of a cult starts to fall apart and becomes another culturally expedient term used to describe our complex political moment. Two-party politics contains a built-in dialectic about the interests of the people, in which each side will always accuse the other of acting against those interests. While one party or leader might possess qualities that appear cult-like, the U.S., at least for now, is still a democracy, or technically a republic. Shh, don't tell the author this. There are nominally equal branches of government that provide important checks to the balance of power. Recent efforts to minimize the reach of the courts over executive privilege notwithstanding, the judiciary is still empowered to halt executive decisions. This is by no means to suggest that the mass destruction of the federal bureaucracy we are currently witnessing isn't alarming. As a parent of two young boys, I am concerned about the character of the men in our highest office and how they present themselves to the public. I believe in the government institutions that make us a union of states rather than a pastiche of fiefdoms. Okay, pause here. I guess he's not concerned about any women. AOC and Nancy Pelosi are fine. Or is he just speaking in old terms? As for the character of the men in highest office, please go back a century, 150 years, 200 years, you will find that every single generation has had questionable men. If you do not believe that, please point to a year in the history of America and point to the Senate and everyone in the Senate and tell me, yes, every single person there was an honorable man. Every single one. I will laugh at you. I've read the history of our politics. I've read the history of our presidents. We've always had questionable and questionable characters in government, going all the way back to George Washington. Okay, all the way back. You got to figure, well, John Adams wasn't horrible, but he wasn't liked by anyone. Thomas Jefferson was going to go after Aaron Burr and didn't care about the law. His plan was to bring him down, even if it meant removing the Supreme Justice from his own position, just to make that happen. You're going to say that's a questionable thing? So we've always had this. As for the mass destruction of our federal bureaucracy, this guy hasn't read history. According to Franklin Pierce, the Constitution was destroyed by the time he became our 14th president. According to John Adams, our second president, the Constitution was already unrecognizable. If you go back to any point in time, you'll find that there are presidents who are fighting against the bureaucracy. The mass destruction now is a lot of propaganda. Is Trump doing things that are questionable? Yes, but we had Biden, we had other people in office who also did questionable things. But right now, the goal is to bash Trump so we make sure everyone thinks we're in a mass destruction of our government, when really lots of things have happened almost every decade that could be called a mass destruction. It's changes is what it is. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, but this is not a new thing. We don't have Trump destroying our government. This is so far from new. It's like no, it's not in the least. We have other things being destroyed in society like gender and science, but what he's doing is really not too crazy compared to others who have held that same position. Um, Franklin Pierce was actually accused of destroying government because he nominated people for positions he felt were best for the positions, even if they were of the other party. and that wasn't how you did government. You put your friends into power, and he was considered sort of the antichrist of the United States government, trying to destroy the United States. So this is not a new thing. As for the bad character, as I just said, we've always had them. Just read history. The question is not, are we shocked by the bad people we have in office? What do we do about them? That's the question. And if this guy's really worried about the character of men in our office, is he worried about Graham Plantner? Okay, to continue reading. For the time being, however, I do not believe we are in a cult. One of the strangest things I witnessed during my years living in and around my parents' guru came after we had left the group. My father began to hold his own weekly meditation groups and became more outspoken about his spiritual beliefs and abilities. He started to believe that he had the ability to heal people by touching them, and that he could divine their futures with the help of his psychic abilities and tarot cards. He began to have visions of angelic souls from other dimensions visiting him with important messages for humanity. He wanted the power and reach of the guru who had left him behind. He wanted to be a guru himself until he got sick and then passed away. End quote. Facepalm moment. I can't tell you how many folks I know who have followed Adidam, left, and suddenly become gurus. It is beyond shocking. It's like, yeah, no, you just really want to be Adida because you don't want to work 9 to 5, or you want his fancy life. I literally can't tell you how many people I know who have left gurus in general that I've seen and then become a guru. And it's very questionable. Anyways, continuing to read. Few people would deny that Donald Trump has a powerful desire for authority and control, which I would agree with. Many find that cumbersome, obnoxious, or dangerous, but his desire for control does not make him a cult leader. We may have elected a president who seeks more than his fair share of authority over the three branches of government, but until, or unless we disassemble those powers, there are still boundaries to his behavior. Whatever your feelings might be about Trump's sociopathic behavior, the term cult doesn't feel effective. Should his administration succeed in dismantling the branches of government and giving full authority to one individual, that would be a different situation. Pause here. It is fascinating to me how many people say that Trump is destroying government and breaking the boundaries of government, but yet he's still fenced in by these boundaries that he supposedly has broken, which is really weird. How do you break boundaries and you're still tied in? He's not. He's pushing boundaries, but so did Obama, so did Reagan, so did Franklin Delano Roosevelt. They've all pushed boundaries, but he's still tied in by them. He hasn't destroyed anything. This is literally propaganda. And I agree with this guy where he says it's not a cult. Donald Trump and MAGA, they're not a cult. I don't know if he goes into more details. Not really. Sadly, we're almost at the end. We only got one paragraph left, so we're going to read it, and then I'll keep going on my thought. So, quote, Trump's worldview may be informed by an outsized ideology, and he is clearly energized by the vigor and purity of his believers. He hungers for the allegiance of the crowds at his rallies and runs his staff through a Byzantine maze of loyalty tests. A cult, however, is a group singularly directed by a sociopathic narcissist who seeks to control their followers to do their bidding and move in whatever direction they alone choose. For now, we still have a choice. And that is the end of this article by Jonathan Hirsch, who the biography says is the founder of Neon Hum Media, which works with Sony Music, has worked on over 100 shows, including with Rachel Maddow and with Keith Morrison, Dateline, and Donnie Wahlberg. That last line is amazing. He goes, yes, a cult is whatever a narcissist is telling you to do, and you do it. And if you don't, there is a problem. You do not have a choice in a cult. I chose to do things, disagreed, and was shunned, and then I left. You have no choice in a cult. I've never met a MAGA who felt they had no choice. We all have choices. 100% of us has choices. And you can argue, well, trans people are having rights taken away and women are having rights taken away. Name one right that a woman doesn't have today that she had under Biden. No rights have been taken away, particularly since that would probably be an act of Congress, not the president. But we have a choice. And also with cults, they control every aspect of your life. Adidam had a book that was published not directly by him, it was sort of a devotees only guide that I saw at one point. I wasn't allowed to, I wasn't a devotee yet, but I saw it, and it gets right down into how to brush your teeth. In Adidam, there was clothing requirements. I've seen it also in the world of Shri Chamnoy. I think I've even mentioned on this show how followers of Shri Chamnoy all looked very strange and they all looked alike. In Adidam, you were not allowed to name your child Franklin or Frank or have long hair. That is cult behavior. And if you did, you'd be chastised. I don't see anyone saying you can't name your kid Donald, can't name your kid JD. You can't comb your hair weird. You have to wear certain clothing. It's not happening. Donald Trump isn't saying, here's how you brush your teeth. He isn't saying that. He doesn't control our behavior. He doesn't control our thoughts. And if we break from him, we do not get punished. Now, I wish this guy had gone into more details on this, and I think he sadly spent way more time trying to define a cult and then sort of was fairly dismissive of Trump, going, well, he's not really. And I wish he could have elaborated more on why Trump is not really. But I think this article is still interesting. I didn't know when I went into it that he would basically agree with me that Donald Trump and MAGA is not a cult. I do want to talk about one little thing. That is that I see people go into this argument and they completely dismiss the idea that MAGA is a cult, but then they talk about how Donald Trump is a cult leader. I've seen Robert J. Lifton himself do this. Well, Trump's a cult leader, even if the question is MAGA a cult? And I think that's a little deceptive because that's a completely different question. Is Trump a cult leader? Is MAGA a cult? Are two separate questions. And I would say, can you have a cult leader without a cult? Or do you just have a narcissist or a sociopath, as this article says? However you want to describe him. I describe him as a narcissist. I don't know if Trump is a sociopath, but I certainly think he's a narcissist. Does that make him a cult leader if he doesn't have a cult? Do you think there's a cult around Lamar Alexander? Do you think he has a cult? Do you even remember his name? One might say he is a narcissist. So that makes him a cult leader according to some things. But can you have it? Would you be a cult leader if you don't have a cult? So if you immediately say no, there's no cult, he's just can he still be a cult leader? Is Marilyn Manson still a cult leader if nobody gives him the time of day? No, he'd just be a narcissist. And I think that's one of the ways we've deceptively answered this question. Is MAGA a cult? Well, Trump's a cult leader. Okay, but if MAGA's not a cult, then he's just a narcissist. He's not a cult leader. Would you say Adam Schiff is a cult leader? Are there cult members of the Adam Schiff world? I don't think so. Or is there a, was it Jerry Nadler? Is there a cult around him? Don't really think so. Is he a cult leader? No, but he's certainly a narcissist, and I would even say maybe treasonous. Doesn't make him a cult leader. And I think we deceptively mix these questions up because we want Trump to be the bad guy. So we try to put all the stuff on him, but it really doesn't work if we're sticking to definitions. Okay, so I actually am going to bring the show to a close now. There's nobody in the chat window to go back to me, so I won't respond to anything there. I wish there had been. I would have liked to have seen what some of you might have said, but that's okay. You can catch out later in the comments after the fact. There is another article I will be reading that I have found on this, on whether or not he's a cult leader or MAGA's a cult. I don't remember if this is from a religious person or not. I found it a long time ago. Well, we're going to share that. And down the road, I do hope to do a show where we'll take Robert J. Lifton's points and go through the woke progressive thing and dissect that. That is a plan down the road. But for today, I just wanted to share a different point of view, or what I thought might be a far more different point of view, and someone else's opinions to flesh out the situation And of course, I know some people say, well, you're arrogant and you're putting all your ideas into this, but hey, it is my show, so I can do that. When I'm also, when I throw out these contradictions and things that I feel, it's not that I'm necessarily feeling that I'm absolutely right and that I'm an arrogant asshole and that I'm shoving my ideas down your throat. I've been accused of that, but that's not it. What I'm really trying to do is just spark a discussion with myself. Since you're not talking to me, I have to spark it with myself. So it's a one man discussion, and I'm really trying to just flesh out ideas and show there's different things. I may be wrong on some points, and I have welcomed people to call me out for those points. If you have an article that completely disagrees with me about MAGA being a cult, please kick it to me. My email is down below. I would love to read it. I have no issues being wrong. But if it's a one man discussion, so basically I'm saying join me in the chat window. Join me in future episodes, and we can work through some points. So that's it for today. Thank you so much. As I said, it's 4th of July here in America, and if you're in New York, you won't be celebrating it because you voted for a commie. No, well, yes. For the rest of you, for who, all of you who are celebrating it, I don't know if you can hear the siren outside my window right now. Don't let that be you. I seriously mean that. Be safe. I will be in bed because I don't give a shit about fireworks, and I will be talking to you later. I know next Saturday I will be doing a show on Marianne Williamson as part of my Gurus Debunked series. I don't consider her a guru, but she is sort of a spiritual teacher, and my series does feature people who aren't gurus. And I realized recently that I knew nothing about her. I had seen her during the political campaign. She came to town. I didn't see her though, but saw some interviews. And I really didn't know so much about her. So I thought, well, let's do a series because that's really what the series is about, finding out what these spiritual teachers believe and what they share to rope folks in. So that will be next week. Check that out. And I also have plans in the very near future to be dissecting the Book of Mormon, which I have read. And, and I'm looking forward to that. So stay tuned, subscribe, and if you don't like YouTube, you can check this show out on BitChute, Rumble, Spotify. It goes out on tons of podcasts. You can check out the list below. That's a list that I hand did going through Google. Okay. Uh, the show is out there. It's worldwide. It has lots of listeners, and you can, because of that reason, you can find it anywhere. So I understand if you don't care for YouTube. Everything goes out about a day after I broadcast here. I like to cater to all of your needs. And with that, yes, that's it. Have a good day. Enjoy the rest of your weekend and be safe. And I will check with you at least by next Saturday, if not before then. So, yeah, thanks.